You wanna grow and go and get there. Sometimes upward, sometimes nowhere. You've got the ideas, you're looking up at the clouds, but how do you start standing out of the crowd? So build it with us from the ground up.
Hey everyone, welcome to From the Ground Up. I'm Zach Conway. I'm here with Kelsey McKenna. Kelsey, we're excited. We have somebody with us today, a special guest. I want to tell a little bit of a background story to lead into our intro. I would say, most of our listeners have probably heard my background as an advisor before starting the company. My dad and I were really, together building and growing our wealth management business. We try to kind of pride ourselves on being students of the industry. We're always trying to learn, figure out what we should be doing to, get to the next phase of the business, grow, deliver a great client experience to our clients. One of the ways we were trying to do that was going to coaching programs, one of which was called, I think at the time, Peak. Our guest is going to help me remember the history here, but I think it was called Peak Coaching. It's now Carson Coaching. And so we would go to those conferences, we would learn a ton, and we actually paused going to them because we had to bring it all back over probably like a decade of going to the conferences and actually implement. That's the hard part, right? You got to learn it all, and then you have to actually try to bring it to life in the business. So we hit pause on going. We worked on implementing, and I would say, and I've shared this before, a lot of what we learned and implemented from those programs really inspired what we ultimately were doing. And when we launched Seeds, it was part of the, what we learned kind of brought that idea to life. So then we launched Seeds. And as we started with the company, we thought about how do we kind of want to bring it out into the world? How do we want to actually communicate its existence? And we thought, why not bring it to a conference, bring it to the industry? And why not bring it to the conference that we got so much value out of back when we were going as advisors? So we called up our friends at the conference and said, hey, we're not coming as advisors, but we'd love to come as founders of this new wealth tech company. And they said, sure, let's see what you guys are up to. That sounds amazing. So we did that. We went and we ended up meeting lots of great people, but one person in particular who's here with us today, a guy named Jamie Hopkins. So my dad and I at the conference listened to some great stuff with, Jamie on stage sharing his thoughts on the future of the industry. And we're like, this guy, I think we know what he's talking about. So we ended up spending some time with him. And then shortly after that, we actually had some fun. We've done some podcast stuff together in the past. We went down to Austin, Texas to do a podcast with our friend Adrian Grenier. Had some fun in Austin, Texas, and then became friends. I hate to admit this now that he's here, but I would say it wasn't until sort of way after that I realized what this guy's credentials were. So I'm actually going to read them because it's a long list. Jamie he's a CFP. He's a ChFC, CLU, RICP. He's also an attorney. He's, of course, a professor, naturally. Got a bunch of those like 40 under 40 awards and probably lots of other things like that. Really impressive. He's currently the Chief Executive Officer of Bryn, Mawr Capital Management. Today, we want to talk to Jamie about his other role. So he serves as the president of the FinServ Foundation, whose mission is to build a more inclusive, representative, and vibrant financial services profession by working directly with colleges and universities to support the next generation of skilled professionals. Jamie, welcome. We're excited to have you.
Thanks, Zach and Kelsey, for having me on. Yeah, it was, I get worried when you start with the stories and the bios, and I'm like, we're going to be here forever. And, but no, it's awesome. It's awesome to be on here. And I do like some of those memories. They were good times. I had such a fun time in Austin and, just some of the interviews and conversations. And that was one of the first times we really went on the road with that podcast, where we packed up all of our gear and flew around to some locations, drove to people's houses, set up in their kitchens and backyards. And it was a blast.
Yeah, a bunch of full circle moments, right? It was really cool for us to be at that Carson conference as founders of a wealth tech company, as opposed to having been there for many years as advisors. So that was really cool. And I should shout out the producer of that podcast for you guys back then is now the producer of both of our respective podcasts. So a bunch of full circle moments here. Jamie, I want to frame up the conversation with some math, so some stats, and then we can kind of dive into it. Here's a stat. More than 109,000 U.S. financial advisors, representing almost 40% of industry headcount and 40-ish% of the actual AUM in the industry, will likely retire over the next 10 years. So not in 10 years, but over the progression of the next 10 years. So I think that's Cerulli study. So that's sort of like one side of the math equation as we think about it. The other side of the equation, so on the growth side, who's coming into the industry? Financial advisor headcount grew by about 2,500 advisors in 2022. But the failure rate among rookie advisors, this is also from Cerulli, was around 70%. So you've got 109,000 professionals leaving over the next decade. So if you chunk that down, let's say it's roughly 10,000 a year. You had 2,500 coming in, 72% of which arguably won't make it. So that, if you do the math, back of the envelope, that's kind of a rough demographics gap that we're grappling with as an industry. So we wanted to have you on, given your role at FinServ, to talk about that. And really, I guess to hand it to you, we talk about a pipeline problem, right? The big firms trying to hire argue that there are supply challenges. Is that a problem? I think the math suggests it is. But whose fault is it? How did we get here? Why is this the way that it is? And let's start there. I know it's a loaded question, but take it from there.
Yeah, we can start there, right? Whose fault is this? Just point blame at one person and blame them, and it's it's clearly
we want to name one individual.
Clearly Taylor Swift's fault, right? Like it's without a doubt somehow she set the demographics of this industry 30 years ago, and right?
It's a conspiracy.
No, so like the interesting thing is when you start hopping into like who's at fault here, what went wrong, I do think there are things that the industry did, like decisions that companies made strategically that were bad for long-term pipeline growth. I'll go over a couple of those. So, but I'll start with a positive thing, then we'll go into that. So the one thing I do tell people coming into this industry right now, I talked to you, we have over 500 students in FinServ right now. And so you look at those numbers, I mean, I think there are more people coming in than the Cerulli numbers suggest. But that being said, they've got great data. The failure rate's really high at the 5-year mark. It's actually like, it kind of tweaks down overall for client facing, I think down to like 15 to 18% historically. So that 72 is like even better than the overall at 5 years. So it's a tough market. The good news is if you stay in this profession, if you're part of that, 15 to 20 some percent that stays in here, there's never been a better time in the history of the world to be part of financial services. There's more wealth, there's more liquid wealth, there's more complexity to taxes, money, integrations, planning than there's ever been at any time before. So if you think about it from that side, being in this profession for the next 10, 20 years is an absolute great place to be. Now, it doesn't mean it's easy, but it is a great place to be if you can be here. So I tell students that all the time. I mean, I've convinced pre-law majors and pre-med majors and accounting majors. Like I've convinced people all across the board to switch majors when you start talking about this profession. It is a service profession, right? Like we're here to serve families and households and people who are trying to find that financial freedom, whatever that means for them across their life. Now, getting to the pipeline problem, there is a pipeline problem. I don't worry about the number of people as much as I say the type of people that come in. So the numbers, as you said, it's a math equation. But what I would say is maybe there's a natural kind of recognition out there that technology and efficiencies inside of this industry are going to improve a lot over the next decade. And the reality is we might not need as many people to serve the number of people we need to serve today. So if you also look at the Cerulli data, really for the first time in 15 years, the last 5 years, large firms have started to show technological and operational efficiencies to the point where they are serving more clients with fewer people at a more efficient rate than they ever done before. The weird part was from kind of late 90s to the middle of 2015. The large firms never demonstrate any of that ability to scale. Every time they added a client, they added a person, right? And there wasn't that growing difference. The last 5 years, that has started to change. And, even though large firms told us this, the data is now starting to suggest it too, is that the largest firms are the fastest growing firms. There was always an argument about that. You can go back and find old Kitsy's article where they dissected it. But that has shifted now. The fastest growing firms are the largest firms, are the most efficient. So on a strategic efficient frontier in our profession, they have finally moved out there. It took longer than a lot of other professions have taken. But large firms can now serve more efficiently than some small firms, for what it's worth. I do think AI, tech, things like seeds are going to allow people to push that efficient frontier from a strategic aspect further out. So every year that's moving out, which will allow us to serve more and more people. The issue that we have more so in our profession is the fact we don't have a lot of people entering in that want a sales component of their job. That's actually what concerns me the most. Even when I talk to FinServ fellows and students at these colleges and universities, the CFP curriculum, which I'm a CFP professional, I've taught the CFP, I've built content for it, is a little bit anti-sales in the culture that's developed around it. Because CFP was kind of hey, we're going to develop this lifeblood of the planner, but not necessarily always being the advisor. And that advisor-focused career path has become murkier. There's a very clear CFP track in education and training. There's very little sales training that comes out of that. And the reality is, anyone who wants to be a front-facing advisor has to have some sales skills. And sales skills aren't bad. Lots of industry sales skills are welcome. Most CEOs are great salespeople. The visionaries that people look up to as business leaders are great salespeople, right? Sales is about communication and connection. And that's really what it's about. That's not happening. And so that's that's the part that scares me more than the numbers. I think the numbers are fine, but I think if everybody comes in and says, hey, I really want to be a planner, I don't want to be front end with advisors, that's a scary part. Because if you get such a move away of advisors in this space, what the economies of scale will force is that AI and tech will have to fill that seat more than people will. I don't know that everybody's ready for it, but it could just force it, right? We might not have a choice in 5 years. You might look around and say, 50,000 advisors retired. I can't find one. I have to use technology. I can't find a person to work with.
Kelsey, can you speak to, we were just talking before the podcast, an anecdote you shared about sort of that reputational challenge we have as it relates to sales.
Yeah, it's funny that you just brought that up, Jamie, because I was at FPA, one of the conferences, and I found myself sitting with a bunch of next gen members, and they were all talking about, are we going to go to a firm or are we going to go to a tech company? And they all are kind of those planning minded. And I was like, well, why? What are you weighing? And the thing that was making them want to go more toward the tech side is that they can be on the planning side and feel more like they're in the service of planning via tech versus they're being asked to sell when they go into these advisory firms. And not only are they being asked to sell, but it's old fashioned, what you would consider older fashioned, call your family and friends and get them to come over here to our firm. And then, the fail rate is so high that there's the issue of, well, am I going to be pinging all my family friends and then I'm going to fail out? So that's actually what they were talking about. And so we were diving in with my background being in planning tech into weighing what would that career path look like versus a traditional firm. So it's so interesting that you bring that up. And I do think the reputation, there is this fear of sales, which we've touched on in previous episodes as well, for sure. How do you coach through that? Just out of curiosity, are you coaching folks through that via FinServ and talking about sales and trying to rebrand a little bit?
So in FinServ, we are. The way that we looked at FinServ, so for people who don't know FinServ Foundation, we're a nonprofit organization. It started back in kind of 2019 when there were some of the conferences and events and development programs that were kind of shifting away from the next gen group. And we said, how can we fill a little bit of that gap? So myself and a couple other professors, and then BlackRock, Carson, a handful of other really great partners came together and said, let's put a development plan out there for individuals. I remember one of my conversations, so I was talking to Michael Lane, who Zach knows too, who was the head of US iShares at the time. And I was like, well, the only thing I don't want to do is like start a nonprofit. Like it's a lot of work, and like I don't want to have a board and file taxes and all this stuff. And, fast forward a year later, the only way I really could get the funds for this in a centralized location was that. And so I set that up. And we do three things in FinServ. We do what I'll say is kind of education/group coaching. We do that for 2 years. So we pull people into the program their second semester of junior year. We work with them all the way through their senior year, and then kind of that year after they graduate. The second part we do is we do a 6-month structured mentorship program. So we have about 150 amazing mentors out there that are CFP professionals, CFAs, all different walks of life and financial services, mostly CFP kind of advisor type, but we do have other people. And so we do 6 months with the students there, and then we take them out to a conference during this time period too, where we cover all the costs. We've done Excel, we've done FPA National. We have a great partnership with Nitrogen now. We'll be there the next 3 years, bringing students out to that one. And so we kind of try to give to that same point. Like some people are looking at the fintech side, some are looking at more traditional advisory or financial planning. So we try to give avenues for all that. We do some smaller conferences too, like CAFP, which is the African American Planner Conference. So we'll take some of our Black American students out to that one so they get that experience and community that doesn't really exist at the other conferences necessarily for them. Those are the three things we do. When we look at the content in education, though, we're not trying to teach anybody the technical CFP-based, like tax or investing or any of that. We really looked at it from like the networking. We looked at it from communication, how to work well with your team members. So we do DISC assessments for the individuals so they understand who they work well with. And we do cover like sales and how to approach people. Those are always the fun ones. Like literally last time we did is 2 weeks ago from this recording, we were doing one of the webinars and just talking how to network with people on LinkedIn and just, how you approach that. And I thought it was interesting. We probably had 4 or 5 speakers that all gave different answers, but I felt the same as Michael Lane and Kellen Brown were talking about it. It's like you also want to get out of LinkedIn quickly, which was an interesting way. I don't know that I spend a lot of time thinking about this, but like if you ping me in LinkedIn, I don't want to have like a 2-day long conversation with you in LinkedIn, right? Like I'll check the message once. And so it's like, get my email, send me your email, those types of things. And then also for young people, like don't send me your Calendly link. And that was like all of us. It's like, I'm not looking for time on your schedule. Like, that's not how this works. Like, like we can figure this out, but it's not going to work that way. And, but it was interesting. Like they haven't been taught that. They don't really talk about it in schools. And I think a lot of companies don't have much training on that anymore. So, that's kind of gone away. So we feel that type of education is really important. I will say the group that we get to work with in FinServ really does inspire you that like we're going to be okay. I mean, working with 500 of these people going through personal financial planning programs, I'm like, this is a really amazing and probably further along in their understanding of this profession and technical knowledge than any of us were when we came into it. When I look around, like at my cohort of people. So on that side, it's very promising. I don't know what happens with this whole, as Kelsey brought up, like this sales or anti-sales aspect. That's one that I haven't really broached this conversation yet, but Dr. Craig Lemoyne and who I don't know if he's been on before or whatever, you guys, I know Zach knows him, but we've talked about actually bringing this up with the CFP board because the professors that teach the programming at most of the universities are really not sales advisors. So they actually like this happens in academia where you're like, well, go into the planning world. It's more like it's more pure because you just work with the numbers and like you don't have to go get the clients. But I've been hiring in 2 decently sized RIAs now. I was at Carson. We had about 1,200 people overall. I was running Carson Wealth. I lead up BMCM and the Bryn Mawr Trust Wealth team here. I don't have as much of a need in either firm for planners only. I would actually say when we post jobs for planners only, I get 15, 20 pretty good candidates that I could probably hire any one of them. You post a job for an advisor and it's the biggest sound of crickets you've ever heard. And you have to go around and look for advisors. You got to pay them to leave places now, probably more so than ever. That's a very different competitiveness out there in that space.
Jamie, so I think there's a fair argument that any pipeline problem is just the manifestation, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? It's we created the problem. The long and short of it is there's something about the industry itself that young people in particular haven't been necessarily seeking the industry. I do think this sales component is is a big piece of it, right? And we've anecdotally been in these conversations. Obviously, you do it basically every day. People are scared to sell, but there's assumptions that are being made about what that means, right? Because of the history and DNA of the industry. To some extent, in the worst case, call it the worst case, or the most extreme case is, a product selling, product storytelling mentality of you need to go, it's the brokerage model of how do we get products into an account. And so even though I think young people do understand that that's not exactly what sales means when they enter the industry, there's enough DNA attachment to that it's scary. And I would argue too, as you talk about scalability and technology coming in, financial planning as a skill set to some degree is going to become increasingly commoditized. The thing that arguably never can be is the human connection stuff. We talk about this in every episode, right? It's your ability to be in the meeting with the prospect or the client and talk about the financial plan and how you're delivering peace of mind and what it means to their family. There's some tool in the background, with your designation that's supporting the actual, tangible output of that from a financial plan perspective. So anyway, this is a long way of asking so I do think that sales bias or sales presumption, our reputation is such a big issue for people. When you walk into, and you were describing all these very specific tactics, the Calendly example, all of that is clearly incredibly important. But when these people walk into your conference room or you walk into theirs, what's your sense of what else is in their head, their preconceived notions? They may already be taking the classes in school, but what are their expectations about the industry? What are their fears about what that actually means? Where they're getting in the huddle group with Kelsey and they're like, yeah, I'm being a planner. I'm not being a financial advisor. I'm being a financial planner. Why are they saying that? What's their, assumptions about what that means?
Yeah. I think the assumption one's good. I'm going to run through some of, as I said, I think there's issues that we have created, to your point, and it becomes self-fulfilling. We'll start with that one, which is there aren't college programs to become a financial advisor. There are zero, right? So you start there. There are zero college programs to become a financial advisor, not one. So, whereas most industries have feeder programs in. Now, yes, there are CFP programs, but CFP programs are teaching you how to become a financial planner, not a financial advisor. And the difference is part of that. It's the communication, it's the gathering a client, it's running a business, P&L, and that's all skipped in the CFP world, right? So there's this whole business element. There still aren't that many CFP programs, and they tend to be in the wrong university sections. So I mentioned Craig, I'll just pick on his, right? Craig runs a pretty big CFP program. I mean, they might be the fourth largest now at University of Illinois, a couple hundred students, and they're in the ag school. They're in the agriculture school. That's where the CFP program is, right? It's not in the business school. And Texas Tech, which is the second largest one, also not in the business school, right? It tends to be inside areas. So that's an issue. The reputational aspect of our profession is an issue because we are mostly in the news when something bad happens, right? You don't end up, on headline news because we created a really cool fund, generally speaking, right? You're in the news because something blew up. Bernie Madoff, when he passed away, was the most recognizable financial advisor, quote unquote, in the country, right? He's the most well-known one. So we are more or less in the news.
Jamie, to that point, that like the fact that it would be believed broadly that Bernie Madoff was a quote unquote financial advisor is such a branding positioning problem, right? Like we all get bucketed, some hedge fund manager who doesn't actually produce reports is a financial advisor. So anyway,
Yeah, no, but like that's a big one, right? And the other one, though, when you get a little bit more behavioral, is the fact that our comp model was mostly variables, very sink or swim, sales orientation to enter this industry. And that with the rise of student loans shifted a lot of people away from that. And that's just the reality. And that's not just us. That's actually happened to multiple different industries during the same time frame that were very sales and less base salary forward. It's had a really big impact on that. If you go back to the mid 90s, people didn't have the same student loan debt coming out. Therefore, they could take more risk with the first job with variable comp. As that has shifted, the notion that you're 22 and you have $120,000 of student loan debt and you look at two jobs and one says we're going to pay you 65, the other one says you can make 150, but we're paying you 10. Like you're like, I can't do that because I can't run the risk of having $0 and not meeting my needs in this environment with a guaranteed payment I've got to make. So that has definitely shifted behavior. I also think the reality is our technology in this space is behind. If you're looking where, and I think that's what's cool to go work is where tech is driving people. And, we're behind as an industry on technology. I mean, like biotech is way cooler today than what we're doing in our space, right? Like you go to a biotech conference and the stuff they're working on is awesome. You turn on Netflix, there's probably 9 shows where the main character works at a biotech firm. So like you're being told, like, go work at a biotech firm. It's, got this more global reach. We're very regulated, which also feels painful. You tell somebody come into this, it's like, well, you got to take like 6 licensing tests. And they're like, but like I could go, I could go over this other industry. I got to take no tests and same job, right? So you have a immediate hurdle there. And then to the other one is we're complicated to understand today. To that point of Bernie Madoff, like when somebody says they're a financial advisor today, unless you know the world, like you have no idea what they do, right? Like people call me up like, yeah, I'm a financial advisor. I'm like, so what do you do? They're like, it's all commission variable products. And I'm like, okay, so you're not really a financial advisor. You're a captive insurance agent, but you call yourself a financial advisor. And like it's a very different world. And that's okay. But we got very murky with that to the point, unless you dive into somebody's business, you really have no idea what they do based off their title. And I think it's hard to want to join an industry when you look at it, that a lot of these students, and this is true, like they don't know the difference from Northwestern to an RIA to a farm bureau agency to a fund manager. They just don't know the difference between what they're going to do in those roles.
Well, think about it. Like wirehouse advisors, understand that there's the allure to the independent space. But think about the education that needs to happen for those types of advisors about what even independence means. And you are an advisor. You're in the industry already, and many of them have been in it for decades. And all these different the segmentation of the industry and the labels of the industry certainly complicates it. Kels, I want to maybe pivot with the time we have to like from the advisor's perspective. So firms that are looking to hire, whether again, the sort of bigger aggregator type firms or the $100 million AUM trying to grow and attract talent, thinking about this from their perspective and just, I'll share, and this is my story. The reason I'm in this industry is because my dad was in the industry. He started in this business 40 plus years ago. I got a job out of school that wasn't this, but ultimately joined him in the business. And so think about it. His hiring process was to go, tell his son that, hey, you're joining the firm. I need your help. We have to build this thing. So you're an advisory firm that needs to hire talent. There's this demographic gap, right? There's this supply and demand paradox. How do you think, like the tangible hiring processes, where to even attract talent. Historically, it's like you walk down the hall or, at your golf course and who's up and coming, some friend that you want to bring into the business. And I do think we need to sort of open that beyond that. But Kelsey, add to that and where do we go from there?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely want to get your take on this, Jamie, because I do think within this podcast, we talk a lot about, what do startups do? So if you're not an advisory business, how do you do recruiting? How do you do marketing? How do you do lead gen, sales? All those basic like business fundamentals, like you mentioned, that aren't something that necessarily happens if somebody's going and getting their CFP and then they go out on their own and they start a firm. So I do work with quite a few advisors who I can tell they're at that limit of how many clients they can take on. They're doing a lot of things right. They're providing an amazing service. They're great at what they do. They're amazing practitioners. And you do get the sense that if you want to grow, you're going to have to go hire the right people. You're going to have to figure out how to build a business around this and make it not about you. Make this about like your system and your full firm with additional folks, whether it's another advisor, ops people, client service people, whoever it is who needs to be hired first. So it's something we talk about a lot. And I do talk with advisors, especially in smaller firms, about a lot. And I do think a lot of them are just putting a job out. They're just putting out a job rec of what they think they need. And I do think there is a lot of room for coaching on like the firm side, which I haven't really done a ton of research on, but coaching on the firm side of how to attract talent. How do you do some of these fundamental things like write a job description that's going to set the right expectations and attract the right type of talent? How do you onboard? How do you interview? All of the things that you would think about in a growing startup environment or any other business. So I don't know, Jamie or Zach, if you want to add to that, but I do sense that from advisors sometimes when they're hitting that limit and they're like, like, now what do I do? What do I do? How do I get the right people? And there's not a lot of resources out there that I've run into that really help. And maybe it is firms like FinServ and going out and tapping into these networks.
Yeah, well, I'll hop a little bit on a couple of those. So what a lot of advisors create when they start off on their own journey is that they create a job for themselves. And then eventually you need to move from that job to a business, which you said. And then ultimately there's a decision somewhere in there. Do you want to move from like a business to a company and then a company to an enterprise if you can? And that's a hard transition. The reality is everybody shouldn't desire to move across that whole spectrum, right? That for some people, you're good at doing the job and you should actually kind of stay there. You should find the right mix and stay there. And then for some people, actually, you do want to be a business owner and you want to lead a business. And I think most advisors, though, really don't want to lead companies. When you watch this occur, they end up not being super happy there. And so they end up just trying to find a way to exit that and sell it to somebody else. But that's a lot where Carson coaching and like Ron came into existence back in the 90s, was teaching people how to go through that evolution of taking this job to kind of making it a company and, how to delegate, how to hire, job descriptions, all of those things. And there's a lot like, I'm not an expert on how to write job descriptions and, but there are a lot of techniques out there, just making sure you're using the right language. If you're trying to get a more diverse workplace, making sure that it appeals to other people. Do you have things that are going to turn off certain candidates in there? But I do think also for a lot of people, it's just like you have to build that network. I hear a lot of people say, well, how do I get to like the local universities, young town? It's like, you have to go spend time there, like volunteer, go to the fairs. You do have to put time in to be a really great recruiter. A lot of the best CEOs of, I'll say, mid-sized companies, they might spend half their time doing the recruiting side, right? Where they're working networks, talking to people, kind of bringing them into the pipeline, building the brand. I don't get to spend enough time now. Like I would like to spend more of my time. I think I told my team when I came on in like 2 years, if I was spending half of my time doing that, I'd be really happy. And it means we kind of did the right thing, because you don't have great companies unless you have great talent, and you just don't. And so one of our core visions of this place is, I want to be the number one, leader of wealth and estate planning in our area. But that requires us to attract really good people, then keep the people that we have here who are great and develop them. We can't be a churn machine. We can't expect people to just grow off of trees either. You got to build those people up and invest in them. And that can be hard for some companies because it's a long-term investment. And if you're driven by a return metric on the back end or investors, it can be challenging because the investing in a 22-year-old today for a 5-year return is a hard sell in some of those situations when the investor doesn't plan to be here in 5 to 7 years.
Jamie, one of the things on a previous episode, Kelsey and I talked about vision to values. So even as a small business, you just articulated, what are you as a firm trying to accomplish, right? So it's not attract the talent so that they accomplish it for you. You're communicating that goal to the marketplace, and people are either going to buy into it or not, but at least there's a clear vision of what you're trying to accomplish as a business. I would argue that a lot of this reputational stuff and assumptions about the industry would be solved as sort of like a grassroots effort in the hiring process if we all had, right, in the Conway Wealth business and all these RIAs across the country. What is it? Like at Seeds, right? My most important job, arguably, is to attract and retain the right talent. Mm-hmm. And the only way I can do that is because we've got a message out in the world, right? We're saying something about what we're trying to do as a business. So I would argue if, en masse firms better articulated that, what that means for each of these firms, so that their job recs are not just, I need you to press these buttons when you get into this seat. It's about what you're actually helping to fulfill as this broader, more meaningful, purposeful thing that we do. Then broadly, hopefully people start to be attracted to those roles, right? And get in the seats, and then kind of, again, self-fulfilling prophecy. Once we get this talent in the seats, fulfilling these broader visions with each of these firms. And by the way, we all truly do have them. We just don't articulate them well, right? Conway's trying to do some pretty cool stuff as it relates to helping families. And a lot of advisors do, but you just have to communicate it well. And then it's the tactics of what's in the job description. Am I not just hiring my son who I know can join the business, but how do I post these roles? Kelsey said it earlier. How do I take people through the right interview process? And there's a whole other area, obviously, we might not have time to really unpack, but the retention aspect, right? How do you actually keep people engaged? And I think that goes back to having, being aligned with some meaningful, bigger purpose than whatever the job function is in the role that you're posting on LinkedIn. But anyway, I think that's hopefully a takeaway for advisors. First of all, they need to be working with you, tapping into FinServ, these different networks. But what's your vision? What are the values of your business? And that should bleed through your whole hiring and retention game plan. And then this is the prescription that'll solve our, demographic challenges over the next 10 years.
It solves the other problem too. If you aren't trying to get big, if you are just trying to have it be just you and maybe, one assistant or ops person, then just having that awareness so that when you're writing that job description, you attract the right type of person who's going to be satisfied and isn't going to be like, if I were hired at a firm like that, I would be going nuts. I would be like crawling up the walls. So like on both sides, like that you communicate in that job rec and on your website as well. Like, what are we doing here? What are we building so that we can attract, if we're building anything bigger than just this, what are we doing and why? And then I think that is a huge, such an important thing no matter what your business is, but especially in this industry where you do have all these reputation and kind of brand confusion and issues that may be swirling in the minds of candidates.
Yeah, we've had a strategic and branding industry convergence. So if you were to map out most of the wealth firms, we've all kind of landed in one spot. Not everybody, but 80% of the market landed in one little spot. You tell the same story, the websites all look the same, and actually most of the visions are fairly similar. And that's not necessarily bad, but there are industries that are much more dynamic, that are much more spread out. Ours is not. Ours has really landed in one spot. Maybe some of that is regulations. It's just forced us to have less creativity and whatever it might be. But we have had that. The interesting part about that, though, is I do think some of the more compelling things in our space are people who are going to break away from that kind of pack and say, I have a bigger, different vision. I'm going to come up with a strategic advantage over firms in this space, which today we're an incredibly fragmented industry. And most firms do not have an operational or market strategic advantage over almost anybody else. Like one RIA doesn't really operate that much better than another RIA. I mean, marginally, but the tech stack is usually very similar. The funds we all have access to the same investments nowadays. Like that's all kind of pushed in. And, like my vision here is we're a little bit different because we have a lot of other services, but like I do want to create more of a full service wealth experience here that is different from the market. One of the things that we have going for us that most wealth firms will never have in-house is the fact that we're a national trust charter, Nevada trust charter, Delaware trust charter. Most firms are never going to get into that space. So that puts us in a very small group of places that are going to be able to deliver corporate trustee services, special needs trusts in-house. Everybody else, even if you get to it, you'll have a partnership with somebody else outside. We also have private banking and some of those things that can attach to RIA services. So when I think about like what I want to offer is that whole picture from here. Now, some stuff will still partner outside, right? You don't ever bring everything in-house. You should always buy, bill, and partner. And some stuff you got to partner on. And that's right. But I have much more of a vision around that and being able to tackle the actual delivery of the estate process and wealth transfer inside here. But I don't think anyone does that great today. I think that's still a big challenge point out there. And some of that actually, just in my short time here, I've kind of figured out, that got really set back further due to the global financial crisis than I thought. I kind of wondered why trust companies weren't further along. There's only a handful that have really kind of done well. A lot of them were owned or had banking aspects back in the financial crisis, and that just put everybody on pause for 5 to 7 years. So it's an interesting dynamic, like coming into the space and seeing a lot of the competitors went away, they got bought, they got merged in, and they just don't exist. It's not a robust, and it's talk about a very hard place to enter. The barrier to entry to get like a Delaware trust is almost impossible today. I mean, Delaware doesn't even want to give them out anymore. The regulatory side on that side makes the SEC and RIA world look like, buying an ice cream truck. It's like super, super complex. And, but it's a differentiator, right? When you start thinking about what you can deliver there is not where everybody else is clumped up together. I mean, similarly, I think to the seed story, not everybody has solved that, right? Like, so you have something that is different than that clump of the market today.
Yeah, I think so. Appreciate that. And also you have something that's different. Arguably not a lot of firms do necessarily. But I would argue that your firm or any firm's ability to best articulate it and why it's valuable from a marketing perspective to the end consumer, but again, back to the topic, to talent you want to attract to help you subsequently go spread the word of what you're doing is really what it's about, right? Being able to say what you do appropriately and to the marketplace and have it feel compelling so that you can attract and retain that talent. Jamie, we're going to land the plane here. One thing we do before we wrap is we try to go around the horn and talk about anything sort of interesting, exciting, or new that you're learning. So Kelsey, if you want to kick us off on that.
Sure. Yeah, I'm actually learning. I'm going back to basics on something this week, and I'm rereading a book about lead generation. It's a newer book, but I've already read it before, but it's called $100 Million Leads. It's by Alex Hormozi, and it's just a very, very concise overview of all of the different ways that you can get leads. And so I'm just going back to that. I love when there's just very distilled, a nice book that's very distilled, very meaningful, very actionable. So I'm going back to that because we're looking at changing some of our website, like landing pages and different things like that right now. So that's what's going on for me this week. Very business oriented this week. What about you, Jamie?
So yeah, mine's actually kind of in a similar fashion. I have been spending a lot of time the last couple of weeks on which probably popped up here, but like I'd say more like business strategy and like how you should be approaching that, what's worked for places. The one that's just been on my mind lately, and I'll share this one. You can look it up. There's a bunch of different things on it. But if you actually dive into like Southwest business model and how they created a strategic advantage is, I actually think, one of the more fascinating case studies out there, because they created like a strategic ecosystem advantage, which is different than a lot of people think. Like I have one thing that's different, and they've put a couple like people trying to compete with them. They've put some very large airlines out of business, not because Southwest was actually trying to compete with them and take their market share, but people tried to come over and compete with Southwest. And it's actually put some of those airlines out of business. So it's this very interesting thing of like people went to go attack them and got wiped out. But like not directly, right? But they're like, oh, we can go take some of that market. And kind of the business thought around it is because almost everybody who's tried it has had either existing limitations or hasn't adopted the full system efficiencies. And like these are things I didn't know till I kind of went through that study. But like Southwest only flies one plane, right? Like, and so every pilot knows how to fly that plane. Every runway is the same. So most other airlines, they'll pull 9 different planes into one gate. So the gate goes out at a different thing. You load bags differently. Like, so their whole system operates under this one plane kind of mantra, like the way that they do their seating, the way they do their bags. And so they do shorter trips on average than most places. There's all these other things that were really interesting. And so they created a whole ecosystem. So if you only take 3 or 4 of the things that they do, like, oh, I'm only going to do one set of planes, but then you decide to fly everywhere, it doesn't work. So like you have to like pick and choose like if you pick and choose parts of it, nobody's actually been able to come in and compete with them, which has been just a really interesting kind of conversation. And then I'm gonna add one more thing here. I know you wanted to land the plane, but because I got to go spend 4 days and got to meet Richard Branson, one of the things that came up from him too was about disruptive innovation. And that often disruptive innovation occurs in areas where you actually have a crappier product at first that comes onto market. And a lot of people lose sight of that. And you think like disruptive companies are going to be better than me. They're going to come in and leapfrog me, but they don't. They come in over here at the side as a crappier, inferior product, and they create essentially a new domain for that product. And so there's lots of examples of that, right? Digital photography and Kodak's probably the most well-known one. Digital photography sucked. It was pixelated. Nobody wanted it. You asked every photographer, they're not going to use this. And it eventually created its own domain. I think Airbnb is a great version of it too, because the first version of Airbnb was like, if you told people who stayed at hotels, they're like, yeah, you want to share a room with somebody and the sheets might be dirty. We don't know how safe it is. Like, you might not be able to get in when you try to get in. If you need help in the middle of the night, we won't be able to help you. Like, would you like to sign up for that Marriott Elite member? And you'd be like, no, right? But that's not the market for it at the beginning. Now, you could argue today maybe Airbnb is a better experience than some hotel brands, but it wasn't when it started, right? Like it created a new demand channel and grew up there, then became a really interesting product. And so when you think about if you want to be disruptive in this space or any space, like you don't have to think always about how do I get better than somebody, but where is a demand area, where is something different that isn't being served super well today that I could go into and just be at a different spot on that, I say domain, but like, where is that demand for it? Is it a lower cost, faster delivery of something? And there's a demand for that somewhere.
We can relate to that, right? As an early product, launching the company, and it really comes down to, is there a trend that we can spot, we think we have, right? And a thesis we can apply, and then to some extent, the product has to catch up to it. The digital photography thing, Peter Diamandis in one of his talks, his line is, and it's so great, Eastman Kodak had the R&D department that figured out digital photography. They didn't run with it at all. The same year they filed for Chapter 11 was the year that Instagram sold to Facebook for $1 billion with like 10 employees or whatever it was at the time. So pretty compelling. Mine quick, again, sort of on trends. And apropos, I think, of this conversation, someone shared a stat with me yesterday. There are 15,000, I think this is also Cerulli, but there's 15,000 firms, RIAs, wealth management RIAs, under $100 million of AUM. And collectively, they manage roughly $1 trillion. And so as it relates to this conversation and attracting sort of next-gen new demographics of talent, it's going to be interesting, I think, to see how it plays out with the larger incumbents and how they successfully or not successfully. The pipeline today is small, right? There's not a lot of supply. So do those firms attract the talent successfully, or do the 15,000 smaller firms again, back to that sort of grassroots idea, figure this out individually, but ultimately as a collective and attract the talent? I don't know the answer. It's going to be interesting kind of to see how it plays out. Either way, these firms should be talking to you, FinServ, other networks to start to have conversation with these new demographics. But with that, Jamie, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it. And listeners, if you haven't checked out Seeds, go for it. It's at www.seedsinvestor.com, and follow us on LinkedIn and X, and we will see you next time.